Welcome to the Draknek and Friends official podcast, where we peel back the curtain on puzzle games and the people who make them. I'm Syrenne, the producer at Draknek and Friends, and I'm joined as always by Alan Hazelden, the head Draknek at Draknek and Friends.
Hello.
Today, we're joined by Tana, who you may know from his work on Shape Sender Deluxe. How are you doing today?
I'm great, thanks.
Awesome. So can you introduce yourself a little bit and talk about your game?
Yeah, so I'm Tana. I am from New Zealand, and down here I have been in the games industry for like seven and a bit years, and basically all of that was at a company called Dinosaur Polo Club, the company behind Mini Metro and Mini Motorways. Before that, I studied software engineering, and the intention was always like to just work in software and then make games on my own time until something took off. But I thankfully got a games job right out of uni, unexpectedly. Honestly, I didn't even know games were made in New Zealand until I saw a job ad for a game studio looking for a junior programmer. And so that's pretty cool. And now I have been working both at Dinosaur Polo Club and with my own studio, Dead Teapot, working on Shape Sender Deluxe, which is a physics narrative puzzle game where you learn how to solve these puzzles, get things from A to B, and your new best friend Cindy teaches you how to play and banters with you and challenges with you and eventually betrays you.
Spoilers?
It's for the intrigue.
So what led to sort of your first big solo game like that being a physics-y puzzle game?
Yeah, that's a very good question because there are so many inspirations that I realize came to me while I was developing it, and I assume were just subconsciously in the back of my mind the whole time. The obvious example to start with is Portal. That was a big game on my childhood. And Source Engine games in general. I was really into my Gary's mod. That's probably the biggest reason I got into game dev, was making things for that and playing things. And then once I'd started making the game, I was like, surely someone has made a game like this before, where you're just kind of making this weird little factory of getting things from A to B. And it wasn't until I'd kind of finished the first prototype where I remembered the existence of The Incredible Machine. And I remember that I played that a bunch as a kid on the school computers. And I definitely think that had a large influence over the game design subconsciously. And other inspirations come from places like Polybridge, where you just have these little physics puzzles that are doing specific things. Or like, you know, building a bridge in real life is a very complex task, but Patrick's just really nailed making it simple and approachable. And yeah, I'm sure there's some other inspirational games in there that I've missed out, but I would say those are the biggest ones.
That's so funny that you name a team that I've worked with. Anyways, so is that the type of game that you like to play in your free time? Like how, just because this is a puzzle podcast doesn't mean that there's a right answer. Like when you are relaxing and playing a game, what types of games do you end up gravitating towards?
I like system-y games typically. So I wouldn't say I am a puzzle game player as my like main thing, but I just simply adore games with interlocking systems. And I just started playing Animal Well. That's a lot of fun. Thinking about puzzles and that, even though they're a little more action-y. I haven't got very far, no spoilers. Yeah, I've always been into immersive sims, Dishonored, Prey, things like that. And I often try to argue that Shape Sender Deluxe is an immersive sim because in a lot of the puzzles, I have a puzzle in mind or one possible solution, but I don't always limit the tools they give you so that if you come up with a different solution that uses some crazy physics hack, then you can do that as well. And I really just want to encourage the creativity in my game in an immersive sim kind of way, even though it mainly just looks like a puzzle game.
That's awesome. Yeah, it sounds like you still gravitate towards that kind of thinkiness in games, even if it's not pure puzzle.
Absolutely. Another great example, actually, that I think of is Tom Francis's Heat Signature. That, if you just look at screenshots, it looks like an action game. But once you play it, it's a very thinky, very methodical strategy game because you can pause at any time, and there is not necessarily one possible solution to stealing something from a spaceship, but it feels as though you have this list of tools and there is some solution that exists that you could do in combination, in sequence, that will win that particular level. And I think that's really cool.
Yeah, something I feel like is interesting about that game is I feel like Tom did a really good job of like priming in the trailers or like the videos he was putting out about the game, priming people how to think about that game. And I feel like I don't know how many people went to that game like more blind than I did and had a worse experience because of it, or whether like the game itself does teach you to play it that way. But like I think there's that disconnect between like what the game looks like it's going to be and what it actually is. And I'm not sure if I have a point here, but
No, I think it's an interesting one, thinking about player expectation against what the game is. I know that that's something I'm a little spooked about with my game, having done a recent playtest with some things where I am setting up quite a cute, wholesome aesthetic on the store page. But like I alluded to earlier, the plot doesn't necessarily stick to being cute and wholesome. And that's definitely something I'm thinking about at the moment. I don't have a concrete answer for either, but I think it's an interesting topic.
Yeah, because my gut tells me that you can get away with that kind of pivot easier when it's a narrative pivot than a gameplay pivot. That's unexpected.
Yeah, true.
But I also feel like you're intentionally trying to see that in like the way you're talking about the game on the store page anyway. But
Yeah. I think about games that had narrative twists. I mean, like, you could go, like, really, really extreme narrative twists, like Doki Doki Literature Club, and be like, well, that game is, frankly, like, that game is defined by its narrative twists of, oh, it's presenting as one thing, but then it's not presenting as another. But then also, as soon as like you go in knowing there's a twist, you're having such a fundamentally different experience. Like that experience only works a certain way blind, and then it becomes a very different one. Whereas in terms of like gameplay, yeah, there's definitely been games that I ended up being more thinky than I expected, or less thinky than I expected, or like the first time I played Obra Dinn, I didn't fully understand what it was, and so I was like, "Oh, okay, this is a detective game." But like when I played that day one, I had not necessarily been following a lot of trailers. I had mostly just been like, "Well, okay, it's Lucas Pope's new game. I'm gonna give it a shot." And yeah, it's weird trying to balance those expectations, I think.
Expectation management is definitely a hard one that doesn't feel like it's in everyone's wheelhouse. But trailers and store page descriptions are going to be the first port of call for that.
Oh yeah, and then it's are your screenshots immediately legible for what type of genre it even is? One thing I think about is the original Sokobond. You look at 5 different screenshots for that game, and they just look like the same screenshots, color swapped.
Yeah, that's an interesting one because have been having this exact discussion with my art director, where we want to introduce some kind of variation, both in the gameplay and the aesthetic for the screenshots on the store page, to just allude to the fact that there's more content than there appears. And yeah, store page descriptions, it's a whole science on itself.
Oh, Alan, how many store page descriptions did we end up going with, like trying out for Sokobond Express? Was it like 6 over the course of that life cycle?
I've blocked out any store page discussions we had for that game.
You could tell that one was a bit of a struggle because if you look at that store copy versus all of our other ones, the tone is completely different. We one of our consultants / contractors ended up doing a pass on it. So you mentioned before talking about the sort of immersive sim adjacency of some of the potential unintended solutions with the physics mechanics in this game.
Yeah.
And that's really interesting to me because so many puzzle games try to focus puzzle solutions around teaching, around like teaching or reinforcing that this behaves this way and this does that. And oh, if you put these two together, like you get this edge case. And like gating around that while tutorializing without explicitly like click here to do this, now click here to do this is why this happens. And I'm wondering, like, while you're in this design process, are you butting up with like, well, for this level it would actually be pretty disadvantageous if there were unintended solutions because then the player might not actually fully understand X, Y, or Z?
Yeah, this is a really good question, and I've had these exact thoughts because one of the pillars of the game is about creativity. So I try not to lock any of the players' creativity if they want to, for example, solve a level which could be easily solved with maybe 2 magnets. If they decide they want to solve it with 15 boxes, then power to them, and I want to be able to encourage that. But at the same time, it's exactly what you're talking about, that I want, in some levels, I want to teach a mechanic. And I remember having this one case where the mechanic I was trying to teach is that if you used a magnet behind the entrance to a portal, then a shape would enter the portal faster and therefore exit the other side faster. And it's a cool little mechanic. I think some players ended up calling it, like in early playtest, they called it like the portal railgun kind of thing. And I like when players come up with names for things like that. But I had one person solve it by... It was a very tight space. Like I intentionally narrowed the space so you could ideally only solve it the way I'd intended it, just this once. But they came up with a very creative solution where they used multiple portals where the shape would go into one, get teleported up, go into another, get teleported up, and be gaining velocity from gravity that whole time as a separate way to be accelerating the shape, as opposed to using a magnet to pull it down faster. If I had a diagram, this would be a lot easier to explain. But I really didn't come up with a good way to solve this because, on one hand, they didn't learn the thing that I wanted them to learn. But on the other hand, the constraints that I provided for this other puzzle ended up with them coming up with a really creative, really awesome solution. But that's not what my intention was for them going forward into the rest of the game. And maybe they wouldn't be able to use this magnet acceleration technique in the future if they didn't learn it now. But yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, it's an interesting dilemma that, you don't really get with the kind of puzzle games that we make, where there's like, nope, this is the solution.
I almost wonder if a possible approach would be to double up on those tutorial missions.
I agree.
Where the first one, like, where it's possible that both of them could be solved in other ways, but specifically an alt solution for one can't be the same alt solution for the second. So it's much more likely that at least in one of those two scenarios, the player will have learned.
Yeah, that's a good idea. And I think it'd be interesting to think about the potential overlaps of alt solutions if A and B work on the first level and B and C work on the second level.
Then B is what you're trying to actually teach. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. See, this has just got me thinking about, because your game is a little harder to tutorialize.
Also, am I right in saying you have a linear set of levels rather than branching?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't fully committed to how the metagame is going to work yet, but at this stage I'm thinking it's linear for narrative purposes.
Yeah. Because, yeah, when we have a branching level structure, sometimes something I'll do is I want you to encounter this mechanic or I want you to be taught this thing, but I still want a branching structure. Okay, well, I'll have a mechanic that does it on this branch and a mechanic that does it on this branch. And yeah, like it's kind of like, oh, do you want to wire this up in parallel or in series? And like depending on the type of game that can actually have like for a game with predefined puzzle or like for a game with more defined solutions, it is perhaps more natural to do it so there's more branching and more redundancy of teaching. Whereas in your game, because there's more flexibility in the solution, you can get the same kind of feeling even though they're in a linear set.
Speaking of, if you're doing a linear set, like, how are you thinking about the possibility of, like,
Bottlenecks.
well, I'm thinking of, like, optional puzzles, but, like, also, like, what happens if, for whatever reason, I have puzzle blinders on level 13?
Ah,
Like, I get really stuck on 13, and I know that I could do 14, and I had no problem with 12, but something's going on with 13. Is that, like, something that you are hoping that something like a hint system could help with? Or I'm just thinking, because, like, there's, like, these are different problems that different kinds of games in this space have.
yeah. What I'm thinking is a hint system would be nice, and it fits narratively within the game because the idea would be you just ask Sandy for help with a particular puzzle. And I think it would be interesting because that's another point for dialogue where fun stuff can be chatted about and have little funny experiences there, as well as subverting the hint system later. So that's definitely on the cards, but there's also a lot of levels. So it'd be a lot of hints.
I was going to say, that sounds like if you get the game translated, that sounds like a localization headache.
Yeah. But the other, this isn't like a proper solution, but because most puzzles will have alternate solutions, they typically won't be as elegant as the intended solution. And so hopefully they can brute force it with a lot of springs or a lot of magnets. And it might not sound pretty or look pretty, but they will have completed it. And if they're annoyed about it later, then they can come back to it. And the other final aspect of it is that I think the main line of puzzles I typically want to be fairly straightforward. But like I was alluding to earlier, Sandy, the mascot, will give you additional challenges. So, for example, there might be one case where there's a puzzle that looks pretty straightforward if you had access to springs and portals, and then Sandy will go, I'll give you a Steam achievement if you solve it just with magnets. And so that way, the people who don't want to invest in the additional challenge and just want to complete the game can go through, play it, solve the solution pretty easy. But for the people who want to be challenged and want to have a bit more puzzle can opt into it as they go. And
That's actually a really clever expression of having a ludonarrative implementation for the puzzles, of being able to have a character literally come up to you and offer a challenge in a certain way.
yeah, I like it a lot. And I find it really fits with the character, it fits with the narrative, and it fits with the meta aspects of it, talking about Steam achievements specifically.
Hey, do you want to know something fun I believe you could do with the Steam achievements?
Yeah?
I believe there's an API for removing somebody's Steam achievement.
That would be fun to play with. Like, offer
Yeah,
it up.
if when Sandy gets mad.
Uh-huh.
That's... I'm going to put that in somewhere. That's good.
Just be aware that if you bring that to other platforms, I believe that is a Steam-only feature.
Yeah, that's the thing I've been thinking about. And on Switch, they don't have any kind of achievement view.
No, but you can, like, if you make your own UI for it, like, there's nothing on Switch stopping you from having an in-game achievement list.
Yeah.
It's just not platform level.
Yeah, that was something we're thinking about for mini motorways, is having its own little achievement viewer for Switch.
Yeah, just when it comes to PlayStation and Xbox, they don't like when there's an in-game system that's out of sync with the out-of-game system.
Yeah, true.
It's all really interesting because there's so many unique aspects to this game, between it being physicsy, between it having the narrative, between it having the alternate solutions, and like the potential twisting, and also something we haven't even talked about, which is your plans for user generated content.
Yeah.
Like, how is that factoring in during the game design phase?
Yeah, so we're getting into spoilers territory as a warning for anyone listening, because what happens is as you progress through the game, here's the major plot twist, is just giving you plenty of warning, is that you as the player will get forced to design levels for the game. And so you're playing through it, you're understanding how the puzzles are made, you're understanding how all the systems work together. And once you have, as a player, a strong understanding of all these systems put together, you get thrust into a completely new context for how the game works, which is designing your own versions of the puzzles. And so at some stage in the game, for example, one of the puzzles will be broken and be impossible to solve, and you'll have to be like, Cindy, this doesn't work. And he'll be like, oops, let's go to the next level. And so that's foreshadowing that you will need to fix that level later in the game. And so one example is there's a really thick wall in the middle, and portals can't stretch that far. And so you get booted into the level editor. And to tutorialize the level editor, I just kind of give you the essential tools initially. So in that case, you can create a space in the middle of the wall, or you can make the wall thinner, or you could just delete the wall, or you could just move the pipe over to the other side. And there's lots of different creative ways that you can solve that particular puzzle, or puzzle about the puzzle. And yeah, so how the way that factors into the design is that I'm designing the puzzles with the exact same level editor I'm going to be giving players. So every time I get frustrated with it, I know 100 players are going to be twice as frustrated with it.
And for those level editing levels, do you put constraints on how much they can edit the level?
Yeah, so I put constraints on the output rather than how much they can edit it. Though I'm tempted to look at that again and see how that goes post playtesting. But the idea is Cindy will give you a design brief, and you'll have to match that brief. So in the example from before, the brief was to make a level solvable when it previously wasn't. But another design brief might be, this level is meant to teach you how to use fans. So currently it's too easy, and you should put some fans in to make it more interesting. Or the constraint might be that this required solution to solve the puzzle needs to include fans. And so it gets into this little complex thing where the player has these two states that they're thinking about, the puzzle that they're designing, but also the potential solution that will solve it. And so it gets real meta really quickly.
Going back to something we were talking about earlier about unintended solutions, I'm curious, how many of your levels do you feel like are about a specific solution that you have in mind for the intended solution, whether or not there's an unintended solution? And how many of them do you think are about more of like a problem to overcome? Because I'm wondering if there is a dichotomy there, like, because puzzles which are about a specific solution you have in mind, that can be more or less problematic when somebody finds a different solution. But problems that are just, oh, here's a memorable problem to overcome, in that kind of case, maybe it doesn't even matter how many different solutions there are.
Yeah, I would love to have a decent mix of both. I think that puzzles where there is an intended solution can be more handcrafted to have a particular experience, whereas when it's here's the problem, come up with whatever you got, it's a lot easier for those to be too easy or too hard, or the boring solution is the one that will work really easily. Like, I know one problem I have is some players will latch onto one particular tool and then just use that tool all the time. And it would be interesting to have problems where I know there are multiple solutions have a dynamic way of increasing the difficulty. For example, if we go back to the challenges that Sendy gives you, one example of a challenge could be, here's your most used tool. You're not allowed to use that for this one. And because I know that there are multiple solutions that can work with this, I know they can solve it without using one particular tool. And so that kind of introduces a level that's going to be a little different for everyone that plays, as well as forcing players to move outside their comfort zone in a space I know will accommodate them.
Yeah, that's interesting, because something that can lead to is like the same level having a different feeling for different players based on what they've used before or not. Because like solving this level without tool X might feel quite different to solving this level without tool Y.
Yeah, and it's a risk, because thinking about that level in the context of its surrounding levels, for example, and the flow that I want players to have through that, I think I'm going to have to be very intentional about how and when those more open-ended levels with dynamic difficulty can fit, as to not make players have too many too difficult levels one after the other, or too many too easy levels. But I think it'll be worth the risk. We'll see how it turns out in playtesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm thinking about what we did for some of the secret puzzles in Cosmic Express, where we have in that game there's like a final level which has a lot of different solutions that you can find. So you'll solve that once, and then you'll unlock a bunch of bonus puzzles. If you unlock all the bonus puzzles, it will block off some of the tiles in the final level, and you have to resolve that puzzle without using those specific tiles. And it chooses which tiles to block off based on the specific solution that you found. And then we actually do that for a second time. So you get some more bonus puzzles, and then it blocks off even more tiles. And you have to solve it again. And the thing that I didn't really anticipate when I was designing that is that, like, okay, there's like 6 different categories of solution, and each time you solve it, you're narrowing it down until you get left with one kind of unique final puzzle, depending on which order you found the solutions in. And not all of those 6 puzzles are equally difficult. And so some people end up with a much harder final challenge than others, just by virtue of like the order in which they found the solutions, which is not ideal, certainly not intentional, but it also just has a certain amount of character that I don't hate entirely.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I'm actually doing something similar.
I'm going to sit here and use that as my explanation for why I struggled so much.
It's possible.
But yeah, I'm doing something similar with Shape Sender Deluxe, where so again, spoilers again for the final boss fight, because there is a boss fight, is that you get presented with a level and you have to solve it, but then all of the positions you use to solve that are removed and you have to solve it again. And so it's because it turns space into one of your resources, whereas previously in the game it wasn't. And I find it really interesting, and everyone that's given feedback on it, it's like, oh, that's a fun twist. And I think it really forces you to think differently again. So similarly to when we would remove access to your most used tool, your naive solution, or your solution that comes up the first time you see the level, just isn't possible anymore, or requires tweaking to make work. And when I've been playtesting this, or at expos, for example, I've got a toned down version of it that I use for expos just to test the mechanic. What will happen is players will use their tried and true tool they've been using for the demo so far, but then the moment it stops working because they can't put it in their initial positions, they start to get creative, which is exactly what I want. It's one of the pillars of the game. And I think a lot of creativity comes from being constrained like that. And I think that's really fun.
Yeah, that's great. I assume that's a level where you are to some degree resource constrained, so that you can't have a first solution that just happens to fill in like so much of the space that there isn't any possible second solution?
I haven't done that yet. I feel that I'm going to steal some stuff from Portal for it. So I'm going to steal the whole, again, spoilers for Portal, but it's a very old game. So the neurotoxin idea of just there's a timer for you to solve this puzzle.
Nice.
And by having a unthreatening but looming timer, I think players will be encouraged to do more optimal solutions rather than spending their time making a very long bridge. I have seen someone do that in a playtest. They were actually cosplaying as Link from Tears of the Kingdom, and they were just making a very long bridge to solve one of the puzzles, and I thought that was incredible.
Wow, honestly, at least they fully understand.
They've committed to the character.
Yes, gotta stay committed to the bit. So how did you... I mean, I know the answer, but pretending I don't. How did you hear about the Draknek New Voices puzzle grant?
I think I would have seen it on social media. One of my friends sharing about, and then I think even after I'd already applied, another friend had sent me the link. And it's like, you should apply for this. I'm like, way ahead of you, buddy, but thanks for the link.
What was your impression when you saw it and like clicked in and read about it?
I had imposter syndrome. I was worried that my game isn't thinky enough. I worry that, like, because the game comes off as quite wholesome and simple's the wrong word, accessible. I'm not sure what word to use here, but I was worried that, that it didn't require enough thinking for, the kinds of puzzles that are typically associated with Draknek and Friends.
Did you already know who we were before, or?
Yeah, I don't know many people who haven't heard of Snowman.
Oh, I wish that were true. I wish everyone in the world knew about a good snowman is hard to build. Which you can get now for, depends on the weather. Go check your weather app.
That was a good plant for you.
But I'll tell you this, for your imposter syndrome, that wasn't a concern for us.
Great.
There was basically, it was good to get a chance to talk to you, and then you were joking about how the questions we asked, which are honestly very representative of what we've already discussed on this call, were things that you already hoped we were going to ask about. So,
yeah, it's funny because the answers to those questions are also things I've already talked about in talks about the game design before. So we Wellington, New Zealand, we have like Wellington Game Devs Meetup, and we have New Zealand Game Developers Conference, and I've done talks at both of those about the design of this game. And yeah, the exact things you talked about. I think they were like talking about things being fiddly with these kind of games where you can make micro adjustments and it completely drastically changes the puzzle, things like that. And they're all things I've talked about explicitly. The talks are probably online somewhere as well.
one thing that I am curious about, as part of the cohort, you are, part of the Draknek New Voices Puzzle Grant community, and you did a playtest with other developers a few weeks ago. I was wondering how you found that.
It was amazing. I've done like maybe one or two playtests with a handful of people where I've closely watched them each time, and that was super useful. So having a bunch of people play and then also having discussions afterwards was absolutely invaluable. Not just like catching bugs and stuff, but design discussions and getting different takes on how different mechanics might be perceived, and even having recommendations for games that people thought were similar was really useful, because finding games that do the kind of things I'm doing is rare. It's not completely unheard of, which is cool, but I haven't heard of most of them. So it's great that other people have.
If there's one thing I know about the kinds of people that Draknek and Friends likes to associate with, it's that deep down, a lot of us are puzzle sickos.
Puzzle sickos.
I think Alan is just the magnet that brings all the puzzle sickos together.
I'll just rename the podcast Puzzle Sickos Talk to Puzzle Sickos.
I mean, look, if you want to rename it, I think honestly just calling it Puzzle Sickos is just a really straightforward. Maybe even like Draknek presents Puzzle Sickos instead of the Draknek and Friends official podcast.
It's pretty catchy.
Which truly feels like we just needed to put a name on this.
I like it. I approve.
Do you have any questions for us?
Yeah, I've got 2 questions. One's specific to what we've been talking about, and one's kind of a more general puzzle game question. Mm-hmm. The specific one is, what's the coolest feature you've seen in physics-based puzzle games? Because there's lots of examples. I mean, Hackshot, I think, was in the previous cohort.
Yes, it was.
There's obviously games like Polybridge and things like that. But if there's any... I'm just keen to see the most unique things in other physics puzzle games.
So one thing that I really like, and actually you and I had a conversation about this when we were talking to you in our interview, sort of divorcing setup and simulation as 2 distinct concepts of, I think that a lot of puzzle games, and so this includes physics games, there's a lot of depth that sometimes can be overwhelming or can be sacrificed based on trying to keep in mind how much information, like trying to prevent information overload for a player, right? Like either the designer accidentally is overloading or gets so afraid of like, well, if I ask the player to consider 20 things at the same time, then they're not going to be able to do that. So I'm going to cut back how much I have. Whereas something like and this is not physicsy, but something like an Into the Breach, which is a game that strives to give perfect information in the thinky space, like I think really opens up to a lot of depth without sacrificing any mechanics, but also prevents your brain from getting overtired. So when I think about puzzle game, like physics games, I think about like games that showcase trajectories in real time as you're setting up an angle, right? Things that like are very clear, not just this is the direction it will go, but like, hey, when the ball launches and hits this ramp, this is the trajectory that it will go on. And then you can like see that like maybe translucent line throughout the puzzle experience in real time as you are like trying things and building understanding very quickly and in real time because you have a lot more information. So you're actually like your brain is being tasked with less and less, but you're still having the experience of having all of these interlocking systems.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. You said a couple of good things that I can relate to both my game and my work at Dinosaur Polo Club. One of them is reducing the amount of information you need to keep in your brain. That's like one of the major pillars in Mini Motorways, Mini Metro, like just the mini games in general. The idea that it's low cognitive load and that very little information is hidden off screen technically, and very little information is required to stay in your brain because it's all visible on screen. And I try and do the same thing with Shape Sender Deluxe, where there's no plan and then simulate phase. It's just all happening at the same time, and there's no consequence for missing a shape, or there's just no lost state at all. And because of that, players can get instant feedback as to what their action does. And there's a couple of drawbacks to that, but on the whole, I don't think I'd have it any other way, which is, I think, is pretty cool.
Alan, did you have any other thoughts about things that you find particularly interesting in this space?
Yeah, so I don't think it's particularly going to be relevant to your game because I think you've kind of locked down this side of things already. But when I'm thinking about physicsy puzzle games, I feel like the place I'm drawn to is weird tools, like unexpected types of system or tool. Like a lot of physicsy games, like you've got ramps, you've got trampolines, you've got magnets, and you've got fans, and those stuff are good, and like there's nothing wrong with using those tools well as you are, but I feel like there's potential for a game which just goes in the complete opposite direction. And I'm thinking here, like Moselina, I think is a good reference point for
Yeah.
like that. In many ways, is a physics game, and it chooses not to give you the tools you'd normally expect to see in a game like that.
Yeah, I adore how you just get some very strange interactables. And yeah, it'd be fun to toy with stuff like that for this kind of game too.
And you said you also had a general question?
Yeah, this one's a holistic question. What do you think the biggest pitfalls are in going to market with a puzzle game?
Oh God.
The fact
How
that it's a puzzle game.
yeah, how long do
Yeah.
we have? Okay. Um so these are all gonna sound like the same, but I'm just gonna rattle off a couple that are all distinctly different problems, even if they all in theory might share a solution. I don't think that solution exists, but if one did, it might solve all of these. The amount of people in the audience that are eagerly looking for puzzle games is very low. The amount of people in the audience, and by audience I mean not the audience that Draknek and Friends has cultivated or anything, but I mean like the broad gaming populace who's on Steam, right? I think that the people who buy Baba Is You, play it, beat it or don't beat it, that game's really hard, so maybe don't beat it, and have a great time are not then inclined to go find games like it. That was, to them, that's just a video game, and puzzles are what you do in it. But that doesn't translate to them in their head immediately as I like puzzle games, the same way that like, oh, I play Call of Duty every year. That means I know that I like first person shooters. Oh, I might go play Fortnite every now and then. I might go play Apex Legends every now and then because those are other shooters and I know that those translate for whatever reason. And I think it might be due to a diversity of mechanics, and it might be due to being more niche. Puzzles are not always there. I think another thing is, like we were saying with screenshots and marketing, if your game is puzzle first, then unless you have an incredible diversity of styles of puzzle or visuals, it can be really hard to explain your game in 6 static screenshots. I think that there are enough different subsets of people who do like playing puzzles, of the people who are completionists who really want to see everything, and the people who will give it a try but don't want to feel like they're stupid and will bounce the first moment that they feel like they're really stuck and hit a lot of friction. And like, how do you balance around both of those market realities? And then the other thing is, I think that a lot of other companies, like publishers or platform holders, just see puzzle as an inherently very risky proposition because of the aforementioned problems. So the amount of support that they might offer might be more limited. And then when you come to mobile, let's say, or whatever, well, guess what? You're competing with literally everything. Everyone just expects free with ads and in-app purchases and premium. So like, there's just like a whole stack of like things that are like the deck is super stacked up against puzzle games, which is a big part of why we have the puzzle grant, is because oh god, how do we help? It's why we do cerebral puzzle showcases, to help that genre cross pollination of like, oh, you like Portal, here's games that if you like Portal, we feel very confident you will like, is like curated into sections, trying to have at least one breakout game in each section that a player might look at and be like, oh, okay, these are going to be games like Baba Is You. These are going to be games like Outer Wilds. These are going to be games like Zachtronics games. These are going to be games like et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, I don't know. Alan, do you have anything else that I missed?
Yeah. I mean, no, like that was very comprehensive. I think when it comes to selling and marketing a puzzle game, you can't just rely on, oh, this is a good puzzle game. People want to play good puzzle games. Like, you can't sustainably run an indie studio based on revenue from people looking at something like Shape Sender Deluxe and going like, oh yeah, I want to play a puzzle game like that. You need to like lean really heavily into what is novel that's not puzzly. So it could be like the narrative version, or it could be like the weird like end game gameplay changing stuff that's like kind of meta. I think the more you can lean into that stuff and lean away and partly just trick people into thinking like, oh, this is a narrative experience with puzzles rather than, oh, this is a puzzle game. I think that makes it stickier in people's minds in a way that I hate, but is undeniably true.
Yeah, I'm definitely trying to lean marketing-wise away from the puzzle.
A Monsters Expedition is an open world game about about exploring a museum. Yeah, you have to solve puzzles to get from place to place, but that's not why you're here, right? Ha 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 ha. Man, it's unfortunate because trust me, if good puzzles sold on their own, Draknek and friends would be rich.
I have one more question just to finish off, which is, what's the most memorable physics puzzle game level you've played? It can be from anything. It can be from Portal, Polybridge, anything like that.
Oh my gosh.
I have a really bad memory, and I've not played any physics puzzle games in the last 6 months, so...
Okay, I've got two. I think that they're memorable for two very different reasons. I think the most memorable for gameplay reason is there's one specific shrine in The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, which is so wildly a physics game.
True.
Like,
I like that.
That game is the ultimate in tricking people into playing a physics building simulator, because that's what they wanted to make. And then they're like, well, we have this engine. It's so funny. Honestly, I think that it's much better at being a physics simulation game than a puzzle game than a Zelda game. But there's basically, in my memory of it, I haven't played it in over a year, but you basically take multiple like carts and like build a train and put different things and attach different things to each and like snake it around, and it becomes like a mini Cosmic Express level. And it's really fascinating that it's like, oh my gosh, someone was cooking on this one. Someone was like, what's a weird thing that we can do with the pieces that we have that like really subverts the rest of the game. And then another one, the actual most memorable, is in Polybridge, where it would surface user-generated levels, and there was a random button, and one of them was just someone used the tools to, in giant capital letters, spell the F word. And I hit random, and I just suddenly, that appeared on screen, and I'm like, no notes. No notes.
Was it still winnable?
No. Didn't need to be. If you want to know the actual most memorable, you said most memorable and Polybridge, and I'm like, yep, that's other than the first 3 levels of Polybridge 2, because I played those about 300 times each for work.
Yeah, that'd do it.
But yeah, no, that's Alan. Anything I say jog your memory?
Yeah, not immediately.
One for me is in Portal 2. There's the level where you have like I don't know what they're called, the springs that just you stand on it and it will just launch you on a specific trajectory. And it is playing an electronic or a harpsichord track, and that transitions into an electronic track as you get the top of the arc. And that, I think, is just such a fun way to make players think about the parabola of the trajectory or whatever, and really think about the physics that's happening in a fun, non-puzzle way.
Actually, I have thought of something. So there's this in development game Threadbound, which is about it's like a puzzle platformer. You link the X positions of these two objects in the world, and then when you push one, the other one will also move. And that game, like initially, you're just like, oh yeah, I can link the X coordinate of objects, and I just choosing which to link up, and then oh, now I'm linking the X coordinate of this to the Y coordinate of that. Or and then later on you can like choose like, oh, I can link these two and I can link X or Y on both ends, and I can also choose like whether it's negated when it changes or not. And it's also directional. And that game has some really interesting physics setups where you link two objects or even like more than two objects, and then you push one which affects something else, and like because this object is falling down and accelerating down, this other object is accelerating left across the screen.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah,
I'm looking that one up.
It's a space that is rich with a lot of different ideation, and that's really exciting. But specifically for what we're talking about here, like it's also, there's a lot of space for intentional and thinky design in this as well. So yeah, I think unless anyone has anything else, I think we're good. I think that does it. Thank you so much, Tana, for coming on. It's been a joy to talk to you again.
Thanks for having me. This was super fun.
Yeah.
Where can people find you online?
Leaving the bad site, so I'm just on Blue Sky at the moment, and you can wishlist on Steam. There's a website, deadteapot.games, if you want to follow along. There's a newsletter and all that kind of stuff. And yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I'm hoping that hearing us talk about the game excites people and the mention of spoilers doesn't put people off.
It'll still be fun, I promise, even with the spoilers.
Yes. And yeah, again, thanks so much for making the time zones and all, but it's been our pleasure. And thank you for listening to the Draknek and Friends official podcast. Our music is by Priscilla Snow, who you can find at ghoulnoise.bandcamp.com. Our podcast artwork is by Adam DeGrandis. Our podcast is edited by Melanie Zawodniak. Please rate and review us on your podcast service of choice, and be sure to tune in next episode for more interesting conversations.